As part of our study of Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, we digressed from the main text to take up a deeper understanding of language and particularly the use of root sounds in Sanskrit, which Sri Aurobindo uses extensively to draw out the deeper meaning of the Upanishadic texts as well as the Veda. We looked at an article which appears to be incomplete, partial, which Sri Aurobindo marks as material for a full philological reconstruction of the old Arya Bhasha, where Sri Aurobindo outlines how language originates and how it develops. And he says there that the language of man is not framed on earth but in heaven, and there is a threefold energy: an eternal truth, a manifesting force, and a sustaining delight by which everything is created and everything is perfectly arranged. In entering the domain of human mind, language is corrupted because imagination hunts after new variations, memory and association corrupt, analogy perverts, sensation, emotion, pleasure sees violent and partial satisfaction. And therefore, the language itself undergoes a change, decay, and eventually death, leading to a rebirth. He points out also that there are deities whose task it is to bring back language to its early purity. Guardians, he refers to them, guardians of the sacred language. And from time to time, the language, original language of the gods is reconstructed, and this is called Sanskrit. But that original language itself is now already too distant for us to fully recover. And in one of the letters, Sri Aurobindo reveals that Sri Krishna revealed to him not only the full framework of the new yoga, which he developed later as the integral yoga, but also that Sri Krishna revealed to him the basic principles of the original language and the original etymology by which the whole of the original language could be recovered. And Sri Aurobindo himself wrote extensively. Initially, some of these are articles, some of them appear to be more as notes, but there are, I am told, almost 100 notebooks, of which 40 alone are dedicated to the lists of root sounds and their derived sounds and meanings. Of this, Sri Aurobindo is giving us a basic framework when he says that the skeleton of the original language is in the root sounds, and the rest unfolds through the principles of word formation. And I pointed out last time how these sounds are mapped along the spine in sequence of the petals of the different chakras. And in this text, Sri Aurobindo proposes to provide a framework of reconstruction, but the last paragraph of the article as it survives is now what we will see, where he describes how language emerges, and then we will look at examples of this, how even the root sounds emerge. He goes straight to the process. I shall first indicate the principle on which the roots of the Deva Bhasha were formed. All Shabda, Vak, as it manifests out of the Akasha by the force of Matarishvan, the great active and creative energy, and is put in its place in the flux of formed things, Apas, carries with it certain definite significances, Artha. these are determined by the elements through which it has passed. Now, it's two simple sentences, the whole process is described. A lot of Sanskrit words are involved, so let's just look at what the whole thing covers. Shabda is sound, literally translated as sound. But here it is the vibration of sound, the vibration of meaning, the vibration of idea behind. And he puts in bracket vak. Vak again is a word which specifically means speech, spoken. So when he says shabda bracket vak, it is specifically in this direction of sound turning to speech or vibration turning to speech. And he says, as it manifests out of Akasha by the force of Matarishvan. So Akasha, now we are speaking of the traditional 5 elements. Akasha, which is the ether principle, Vayu, which is the air principle, Agni, which Tejas, which is the fire principle, and then Apas, the water principle, and then Prithvi, the earth principle. And he's describing a sequence of descent from Akasha all the way to Apas, which is the liquid water principle. But he gives them a different meaning. The Apas, he says, is the flux of formed things. So this is the domain where things have taken form, but they're still in a process of fluid interaction, change. Even the form itself is fluid. Originating in Akasha, Akasha is the pure ether, which is almost like a substratum in which the only thing which can survive is vibration. There is nothing other than vibration, no form, no touch, no contact, no sensation. It's pure vibration. So it is as if a substratum which is silent to begin with, and into that vibrations begin. Those vibrations move subsequently or are modified to create the Vayu principle, which is the principle of touch, contact. And you have now patterns of contact, pushing, pulling, forces, we may say. And that is further modified as it moves a step below into the domain of Tejas, fire, Agni, where the patterns of force, contact take on a rhythmic recurrence, and there is the appearance of form. But the form here is not yet rigid and stable. It is just form, but at least you have form and there is perception of form. A further modification puts all the forms in relation with each other, and this is the domain of Apas, the flux of formed things, as he says. But they're still in flux. A further modification makes rigid, and that enters the domain of earth, Prithvi, and you have stable, sustaining appearance of form. Now we have to keep in mind this 5-fold sequence to understand fully what he's saying here. All Shabda, vibration of speech, as it manifests out of Akasha, so it emerges out of that original substratum of pure consciousness, by the force of Matarishvan. So there is a force which pushes it out, a force which creates the vibration and then projects it down subsequently through the levels. And this force is Matarishvan. You will remember in our study of the Isha Upanishad how important this word was. Tasmin apo Matarishva dadhati. In that the master of life establishes the waters. And this is the whole movement of creation, literally. And this Matarishvan is the creative power of the Divine Mother moving things into creation. So the great active and creative energy, that's how he describes it here. So from there it is pushed by Matarishvan and is put in its place in the flux of formed things, Apas. So everything moving like this, from Akasha to Apas, carries with it certain definite significances. Artha. Artha literally translated is meaning. So when the vibration moves like this into the flux of formed things, it has brought with it a certain meaning, a certain significance, a quality. What determines that? These are determined by the elements through which it has passed. And this is the passage in between through Vayu and Tejas, which he now describes. Shabda appears in the Akasha, that's the pure vibration, travels through Vayu, the second element, in which Sparsha is the vibration. Sparsha means touch, contact. By the vibrations of Sparsha, it creates in Tejas, the third element, certain forms, and so arrives into being with these three characteristics. First, certain contactual vibrations. Secondly, a particular force of Tejas, a particular kind of Tejas or force. Thirdly, a particular form. So as the vibration passes through these levels into materialization, it acquires these three things. And it's very important now that we recall what these three are. First, he says, a contactual vibration. When first we hear the sound, there is immediately at the moment of the contact a certain vibration. Ka, ma, la, ta. Each at the moment of contact, there is a vibrational quality. Second, a particular kind of tejas or force. Tejas, you will recall, heat, intensity, and so force. So ka, you can immediately see, has this sharp quality. It's as if a point hitting. Ta is not so sharp. It is as if a focal, as if an object which is blunt hitting. Whereas ka is much sharper, ta is not so sharp, more blunt. La is a soft contact, a gentle push. Even there's no impact, it is a gentle nudge. The push itself is not too strong. Ha is pure force without form. Whereas ka and ta and pa would have form in the point of impact. Ha has no point, no form, it's pure force. And this is the quality which you get. The second thing, particular kind of tejas or force. And thirdly, a particular form. Now, when the sound first comes to you, you will find there's a tendency for a certain kind of image to emerge. You will see there is no form of the image. It's a spreading out, a movement spreading out. Whereas ka has a more specific quality of something sharp. If you take ma, again the feeling is of something as if opening out or something moving gently. La is as if a push of a single point of contact. You will find this kind of a sensation automatically emerging in the sound as it touches our experience. So he continues now, these determine the bhava or general sensation it creates in the mind. The bhava literally translated would be mood. So general sensation it creates in the mind, the mood that forms as the sound enters. And from that sensation develops its various precise meanings according to the form which it is used to create. Now straight away you have the root sounds which have come with specific meanings, and then according to the form which it is used to create, the meaning becomes more precise. And this is where this article as we have it stops, unfortunately. The rest would have developed this idea. Fortunately though, all of those texts which I referred to, so many notebooks, so many articles, they still exist. Some of them have just barely been published in one of the volumes on Sanskrit studies. I hope the rest will be published. We have with us some examples. This is a sheet which you can see how Sri Aurobindo wrote in those notebooks with the root sounds. In this particular sheet, he lists the roots. And primary is dha and dha. And then he explains dha and all the variations which come from it, dha, dha, dham, and explains each of those. So dha by itself is placing, holding, I can't read the rest, something with causing, I'm not sure. Dha, again he lists the meanings. Dham is wrath and other words I cannot see. Next he says dha, and again under dha a series of meanings associated. Then secondary roots, dhak, dhatu, dhal, dhan, etc. And against each of them you'll find a series of meanings listed. And the meanings themselves you'll find have a cluster. They form a cluster of some essential concept taking on specific forms of idea or thought. So it's very interesting to study how the sound itself maps out the concept, the psychological concepts, ideas and thoughts and words which would form in the mind. And all of this is perfectly mapped to the structure of the throat and the vibrational qualities of each of those sounds on the 6 chakras along the spine. So it is quite amazing to see how the physical arrangement, the spiritual force, the biological structure, the psychological meanings, they are all perfectly aligned across the worlds. And the original Deva Bhasha captures exactly that alignment in the formation of words in human speech. And no wonder that it is called the language of the gods. The Sanskrit as it survives today is the closest that we have to that Deva Bhasha. There are other texts, references to this language and its structure from Sri Aurobindo's other writings, from which I want to briefly read a few portions, and then we will look at some examples of the root sounds and their meanings. In The Secret of the Veda, Sri Aurobindo writes, law and process must have governed the origins and developments of language. Given the necessary clues and sufficient data, they must be discoverable. It seems to me that in the Sanskrit language, the clue can be found. The data lie ready for investigation. And then he says, we can find an equal regularity and equal reign of fixed process on the psychological side in the determining of relation of particular sense to particular sound. And this is what we have seen here. And then he gives example. He takes the 4 basic vowels of the Sanskrit language, a, e, u and r. So he says, they indicate the idea of being, existence. A, in its short form, indicates being in its simplicity without any further idea of modification or quality. Mere or initial being, creative of space. And you see a. And that's why you will recall now Ashwa, when we saw how that represents being but taking on the form of force with the Shva. Then he says E, an intense state of existence being narrowed, forceful and insistent, tending to a goal, seeking to occupy space. So A simply sets the space. E has this narrowing, pushing, wanting to occupy space. And U, a wide, extended but not diffused state of existence, being medial and firmly occupant of space. So E is trying to occupy, U has spread itself and occupies the space. Now hear the sounds and see how the sound carries this vibration. A, E, U. And then R. This is very interesting because this completes the steps. R, a vibrant state of existence, pulsing in space, being active about a point within a limit. So there is the vibration which comes here. And you can see how these vowels are the basic vowels for everything, every language. You take a consonant, you cannot speak a consonant unless one of these vowels is attached. If you speak a consonant without vowel, it becomes k, b, t. It is as if unexpressed in space, non-existent. It is barely on the brink of existence, but it becomes existence when it becomes k, p, b. Or it becomes narrow, forceful, insistent when it becomes ki, p, b. Or it is spreading, filling the space of existence when it is ku, pu, bu. Or it is vibrating, pulsing, active around a point, but within limits when it's kr, pr, br. See how the language naturally reflects basic psychological realities and experiences. In another passage from the Secret of the Veda, he explains the difference between the modern mind and modern language and the original Vedic use of language. He says the Rishi's use of language was governed by this ancient psychology of the word, capital W. When in English we use the word wolf or cow, we mean by it simply the animal designated. We are not conscious of any reason why we should use that particular sound for the idea, except the immemorial custom of the language. You say tree, bird. Why do you call it bird? Well, that's how it is. It doesn't matter. And we cannot use it for any other sense or purpose except by an artificial device or style. So you cannot extend the use now because it is locked to that. But for the Vedic Rishi, Vrika, wolf, Vrika meant terror. You see, the word itself gives the vibration. Vrik, Vrika, and Vrika, tearing. Vrika meant the terror, and therefore, among other applications of the sense, a wolf. So you could apply Vrika equally to a human being and say he is Vrika if he is terror. It will not be simply analogy, it will not be simile or metaphor, it will be reality. And this is the problem when the modern mind approaches the Vedic language. It sees it as symbols, similes, metaphors. They are not. They are the thing itself described. But you could describe it at many levels, and therefore the multiple meanings become naturally present. Dhenu, that is cow. Dhenu meant the fosterer, nourisher, and therefore a cow. But the original and general predominates. The derived and particular is secondary. So when we read Dhenu in Veda, it means specifically fosterer, nourisher. Secondarily, it means cow. So another comment he makes in the article called Philological Method of the Veda, he says, the Vedic Sanskrit abounds in a variety of forms and inflections. It is fluid and vague, yet richly subtle in its use of cases and tenses. And on its psychological side, it has not yet crystallized, is not entirely hardened into the rigid forms of intellectual precision. The word for the Vedic Rishi is still a living thing, a thing of power, creative, formative. It is not yet a conventional symbol for an idea, but itself the parent and former of ideas. It carries within it the memory of its roots, is still conscient of its own history. So when you speak those words, you speak them with the meaning of the roots and the vibrational quality and the three specific qualities which we just read about, which the words and the sounds carry. Now, there is one more text of Sri Aurobindo whose original source is unknown, but I happen to have it, where he lists letter by letter the specific vibrational quality and the force and form which come with each of the alphabetical letters of the Sanskrit language. Unfortunately, I had it in a certain form which was of an old file, and the Sanskrit in that old file, when I printed it, the letters in Sanskrit have got distorted. So I'm not able to catch immediately the sound, but he marks, it's a list of all the letters and their qualitative character. Is absolute existence, E, relative existence, U, pervasive, contained or progressive existence. K is possession, mastery, creation, action. K, attack, invasion, insistence, attrition or detrition. G, contact, motion, action upon. G, violent contact, hostile action, strong motion. I see how the H simply brings force and intensifies and amplifies the original sense. So if K was possession, mastery, creation, action, K becomes attack, invasion, insistence. Similarly, G is contact, motion, action upon, and G becomes violent contact, hostile action, strong motion. Ch, I think. Ch is the same with. Now, this is where I have lost the actual letters. But I'll just go in sequence without bothering with the letter now. Perhaps next time I will be able to correct for this. The next sound is the same with greater lightness. The next sound is restless, brilliant, decisive action, existence or contact. I think this is Ch. I don't know. The next one is the same with greater lightness. Then hardness, force, crudity, rajasic. I'm skipping a few now just so that we get a sense of it. Obstinacy, tenacity, that's another sound. Another sound is hard, forcible impact or action. Another is gentle but effective relation. Another is soft touch or impact, kindly relation, possessive action. Another limitation, finality, completion. And I think this one is L. L is love, sweetness, etc. in relation. And the next is, I think, R, vibration, play, etc. And the H is force. So you see here is the little that we have of the detailed lists that Sri Aurobindo prepared. For the rest, we need only look at these commentaries, such as what we are reading, to appreciate how the words and the roots develop. Specifically here, I will look at the text titled The First Rik of the Rig Veda, where Sri Aurobindo describes each root sound behind the first Rik of the Rig Veda. The Rik goes, Agnim ire purohitam yajnasya devam ritvijam hotaram ratnadhatamam. And this very simply Sri Aurobindo translates as, Agni I adore, who stands before the Lord, the God who seeth truth, the warrior, strong disposer of delight. This would be the translation as it would be to the modern language where the words have distinct mental meanings and associations. But so that we appreciate the deeper sense, he actually goes to the etymology letter by letter, sound by sound of the entire verse. And it is an extraordinary reading because a whole philosophy, yoga and occult knowledge pours out as we look at the root sounds. So just I read a few portions so that we have a sense of how he explains it. Agni. So the first word is Agni. The word Agni is formed from the root Ag, with the nominal addition Ni. The root Ag is itself a derivative root from the primitive to be, of which traces can be found in many languages. The G gives an idea of force, And Ag therefore means to exist in force, preeminently, to be splendid, strong, excellent. And Agni means mighty, supreme, splendid, forceful, bright. You see here straight away, the root is holding it at a level of pure concept. And the concept moves into multiple ideas, and he lists them all in order of priority. Mighty, supreme, splendid, forceful, bright. And you can see how bright is nothing but mighty in the domain of light, in the domain of intensity. We find the same root in the Greek agathos, good, meaning originally strong, noble, brave. Agan, excessively. Ago, I lead. In Latin, ago, age, aglaos, bright, the names, Agis, Agamemnon, and in the Sanskrit, Agra, Agasti. So all of these, he says, are deriving from the same root, Ag. And when we observe across the languages, the meaning is resembling each other. It is interchangeable with its brother root, Aj, from which some of the meanings of ago, Greek, are derived. It seems also to have meant to love, from the idea of embracing, Greek agape. Agape is the embracing love, of the divine love. And in this sense, the old Sanskrit preferred ang for the connection between the two roots, ag and ang, angati, in the sense of fire, angiraha as the name of Agni, angara, a live coal. So you see how the word moves to more specific meanings and forms. Now, if this is Agni, the next word ire, which he simply translated as I adore. But here he explains, the root, like all simple Sanskrit roots, has two forms, il and il. The original root was il, to love, embrace, flatter, praise, adore. The cerebral ra is a later form, a dialectical peculiarity belonging to some of the dominant races of the Dwapara Yuga, which established itself for a time but could not hold its own and either resolved back into la or was further transformed into the soft cerebral da, with which it was interchangeable. So we have the form id in precisely the same sense. You see something so extraordinary here. He was actually given the full knowledge of how the roots have traveled across the ages, through the yugas, how they have been modified in their use and so on. And he actually speaks of certain dominant races of the Dwapar Yuga, which had a peculiarity, and so they use this form of ra. And from ra it moves back to la or da. Even today, in certain parts of India, the sound ra is still very common in the language. In Tamil, for example, in Marathi. But in other languages, it has moved back to la or da. There is no idea necessarily involved of adoration to a superior. The dominant idea being love, praise, and desire. The meaning here is not praise or worship, but desire, yearn for. So, ire is not praise or worship to a superior, but the yearning and desiring for. So, Agni I adore, I desire, I yearn for. Agnim ire. The next word again is fascinating. Purohitam. Purohit, loosely today it is translated as the priest. So, this particular verse, the first rik of the Rig Veda, is translated commonly as Agni is the priest of the fire, of the yajna, it seems quite ridiculous. How can the fire be the priest of the yajna itself? So obviously the meaning is something different. And he explains, the words are two, not one. Purohitam, there are two words. The sense of priest, purohita, put on the compound word in the later ceremonial interpretation of the Veda is entirely absent in this hymn. The word puraha, so the two words are pura and hita. The word pura was originally the genitive for pur. Used adverbially, pur meant door, gate, front, wall. Afterwards, so secondary meaning, house or city. The Greek, pule, a gate, pulos, a walled city or fort, polis, a city. So you see how the meaning moves. Even today you will find in the UK, the names of small towns end with bara. It is written baro, but pronounced bara, which is just a distortion of pura. You will find all over India small towns with a certain name and then pura. Vedapuri was the old name of Pondicherry. And the pura is this door, gate, wall, front, and by extension the city with something which surrounds. And the second word, so the meaning therefore is in front. Pura is in front. The second word is hitam. Hitam is the participial adjective from the root hi, in the sense of to cast down, throw down, plant, place, which appears in Greek as heo, I pour, hayaha. Purohitam means therefore set or planted before. So Agni I adore, who is set or planted before yajna. And therefore by extension later on it would easily be seen as priest, because he stands before yajna, he is therefore priest of yajna. But that is how the mentalization has distorted the meaning. The original sense when the Vedic Rishi spoke it was standing before, planted before, established, thrown down, placed, firmly established. And then what is yajna? So yajna, again today the mentalized sense of it is the ritual, the sacrifice, the whole process of the exercise. Yajnasya. The word yajna is of supreme importance in the Veda. In the ceremonial interpretation, yajna is always understood as sacrifice and no other conception admitted. The Veda cannot be understood as the source of all Indian spirituality and divine knowledge if this materialistic interpretation is accepted. In reality, yajna is the name of the Supreme Lord Vishnu himself. Now suddenly you see the meaning changes so much. Agni I adore, who stands before yajna, who stands before the Lord. And now you see the deeper meaning is obvious. The flame of aspiration is what stands before the Lord, sees the Lord directly. It is the only thing in us which sees the Lord always. In reality, yajna is the name of the Supreme Lord Vishnu himself. It also means dharma or yoga, and by later preference of meaning, it came to signify sacrifice, because sacrifice in the later Dwapar Yuga became the one dharma and yoga which dominated and more tended to replace all others. So this is the interesting reason. Again, you have to understand the whole history of the word. And in the Dwapar Yuga, just before we enter Kali, is the phase when the ritual predominates. And therefore, yajna became at that point naturally the ritual, the one dharma, the one yoga which is given to humanity. All the deeper spiritual and psychological basis of it tends to fade at that point, and that's what we have inherited as we entered the Kali. So he says, it is necessary to recover the proper meaning of this important word by nirukta, from the etymology, and in order to do it, to lay down briefly the principle of nirukta. And here he explains now, what is this principle of nirukta? And there's a whole passage describing these root sounds, and I will read the whole thing. Very similar to what we have already read. The Sanskrit language is the Deva Bhasha, divine language, or the original language spoken by men in Uttara Meru in the beginning of the Manvantara. Now the Manvantara is going back a few million years. But in its purity, it is not the Sanskrit of the Dwapara or the Kali, it is the language of the Satya Yuga, based on the true and perfect relation of Vak and Artha, that is the speech vibration and the meaning, when they are perfectly identified. Every one of its vowels and consonants has a particular and inalienable force, which exists by the nature of things and not by the development or human choice. This is how it is, and we just recognize the reality of things. These are the fundamental sounds which lie at the basis of tantric bija mantras and constitute the efficacy of the mantra itself. Now this is so important, to be able to use those bija mantras, that is the seed mantras. We have to pronounce them correctly because the efficacy is in the sound vibration, not in the idea behind. So when you will hear these mantras such as Aim, Reem, Kleem, they don't have an obvious mental association, although people try to bring something artificially. They hold something much more essential at the root, in the origin of the concept of and the vibrational quality. And that's the efficacy. Every vowel and every consonant in the original language had certain primary meanings which arose out of this essential Shakti or force, and were the basis of other derivative meanings. By combination with the vowels, the consonants, and without any combination, the vowels themselves formed a number of primary roots, out of which secondary roots were developed by the addition of other consonants. So we have just seen an example in these three words which we saw. So you have roots, pure roots, secondary roots. All words were formed from these roots. Simple words by the addition again of pure or mixed vowels and consonant terminations, with or without modification of the root, and more complex words by the principle of composition, where now these roots join to make composite meanings. This language, increasingly corrupted in sense and sound, becomes the later Sanskrit of the Treta, Dwapara and Kali Yuga. Being sometimes partly purified and again corrupted and again partly purified, so that it never loses all apparent relation to its original form and structure. Every other language, however remote, is a corruption formed by detrition and perversion of the original language into a Prakrit, or a Prakrit of a Prakrit, and so on to increasing stages of impurity. Now when we read something like this, it's very tempting to simply say, all language of the world are simply Prakrit of Prakrit of Prakrit of the original Sanskrit. And so even as we are speaking in English, we are speaking a multiply distorted Sanskrit. But although this may be true in the history and etymology, it is no more true in the form of the language, because the way the language works now is words associated with objects and ideas. And the character of that original connection with the roots has been so badly lost that we have to call it a different language. But still we see how all languages trace themselves back to that original Deva Bhasha. The superior purity of the Indian language is the reason of its being called the Sanskrit. and not given any local name, its basis being universal and eternal. And it is always a rediscovery of the Sanskrit tongue as the primary language that prepares first for a true understanding of human language, and secondly, for a fresh purification of Sanskrit itself. Now, having given this base, he moves to the true meaning of yajna. And I will just read this one. There are many more. All of the words subsequently he has developed similarly. But I will read this because it is one of the most extensively developed in the explanation. This particular root, yaj, from which yajna is formed, is a secondary root on the base of the consonant ya. The guna, quality, of which are strength and tenderness applied to action, motion, formation, and contact. So this is ya. The primary roots are ya, yi, and yu, with their lengthened forms ya, yi, and yu. The original Deva Bhasha recognizing only 3 pure vowels, the rest being either modified or mixed vowels. The primary root of yaj is ya, which means essentially to go quietly and persistently, to act, to apply oneself quietly and with force and persistence, to master knowledge or anything or person, to master by steady application, to come or bring into contact with gently or lovingly and effectively, to form or express clearly, etc. Now you see how each of these is like a further modification of the essential quality. The first sense appears with its color rubbed out in the lengthened form ya, in yaksh, in one of the meanings of yam, etc. The second in yat and yash. The third in yaj. The third in yaj, yam, and yantra. The fourth in yaj and yach, which is originally a causal form of yach, to give, now lost except in certain conjugal forms of yam. You see how he is describing each of these meanings and how each of these meanings exists in certain word secondary roots. We saw a list of meanings and now they are matched against the sounds. The fifth, in one of the meanings of yam, to show, etc. Besides yach, there are other lost roots, yal, to seek after, love, desire, Greek yalo, yash, with a similar meaning, from which we have yashaha, which was originally an adjective meaning lovely, charming, and a noun meaning sometimes an object of love or pursuit, sometimes beauty, ambition, fame, etc., or love itself, favor, partiality. So just in a quick series, he has shown how the ya moves into 5 different secondary roots, how those roots have survived today in various languages, and how the meaning itself goes through degrees of further materialization until it becomes very specific. From something which is so essential that you cannot apply it to form at all, it moves into domain of form. So you see, at the essential level, it was to go quietly and persistently, to act, to apply oneself quietly and with force and persistence, to master by steady application, to come or bring into contact with gently or lovingly and effectively, to form or express clearly. Now all of these, if you look at, they are purely psychological movements and tendencies. You can apply them to anything, in any circumstance. Apply them to ideas, apply them to situations, to people, and they exist purely at the level of a psychological guna, quality. And then it moves subsequently. Each of those facets has a secondary root by attachment to a second sound, and it moves from there to specifics down the way. This is a brief example of the method followed by the original tongue, as it can now be observed with its distinctions and shades confused and the colors of the words expunged. But we have still not completed yajna. So he says, in the root yaj, the force of the consonant ja determines the meaning. Its essential nature is swiftness, decisiveness, rapid brilliance and restlessness. It has therefore a frequentative and intensive force. It means to love habitually and fervently. So, to worship, to adore. It means to give freely, wholly, or continuously. From these shades comes the meaning of sacrifice. You see how there is this loving, fervently, worshipping, adoring, and then giving continuously, freely. And so the sense of sacrifice. It means to master thoroughly, habitually, with a continual repetition of the act of mastery. The word yat means endeavor, but yaj can never have meant endeavor. It is too decisive and triumphant, and must imply possession or mastery, action, sense of its result. So it is not just an effort, it is the attainment of the effort. It means, therefore, to rule, govern, order, possess. You see how from the pure sound and its quality, we are coming to the form of the action to rule, govern, order, possess. That is why yajna is Vishnu, in the sense of the almighty ruler, the master of man's action, body, thought, the supreme Lord ruling from the higher faculty in man, the Parardha or Satchidananda. But still, this is yaj. We have not come to yajna. Yajna is formed by the addition of na, a nominal suffix which has the sense of action. It may be adjectival or nominal. It may convey the actor, the instrument, the manner, or the sufferer of the action. Yajna, therefore, came to mean he who rules, the governor or master, loving, adoring, also he who is loved. The means of mastery, and so yoga. You see, these are all the shades of meaning. The means of mastery, and so yoga, in its processes, not in its realizations, because it is the action, the na brings action. The manner of mastery, and so dharma, a rule of action or self-government. Another shade, adoration or an act of worship, though this sense was usually kept for yajuh, giving, offering, sacrifice. As the name of Vishnu, it meant predominantly the master who directs, compels, governs. But the idea of the lover and beloved, the giver and the object of all actions, ritual and worship of all karma, also entered into it in the associations of the worshipper and sometimes became prominent. Now imagine the next time you use the word yajna. This is the sense that we have to carry in ourselves. And then the full import of the word and the power of the word is conveyed. So yajna, it means predominantly the master who directs, compels and governs. And then with it comes the sense, the lover, the beloved, the giver, the object of all actions, ritual and worship of all karma. And you can see how subsequently that sacrifice became the prominent meaning because of the period of the Dwapara Yuga. But this idea of sacrifice is involved in this, but sacrifice in a larger sense of giving to the beloved and giving all of actions in ritual worship to the Lord. He then further describes how the concept of the Lord changes across the 4 yugas, and it's a whole long paragraph. I don't think I will go into it. Those of you who are interested can take a look at it. But you see there again the psychology and the history and the yoga of how the human relationship with the divine is fourfold. And in each of the yugas, one of those 4 aspects predominates. And at the last stage in the Kali, he says, all breaks down except love and service. The dharma of the Shudra by which humanity is maintained and from time to time purified. So it's a very interesting description of how we relate to the Lord through knowledge, power, enjoyment, and love. And in the Kali, it is only this last which survives. And so he goes on with each of the words of the first Rik. So we get a very powerful sense now of how language originated. And now when we go back to the text of the Brihad Aranyaka and observe how Sri Aurobindo is drawing out the deeper sense of these words, specifically the 4 names of the horse, we can appreciate the authority and mastery with which he is approaching the whole problem. And we can also appreciate how these words had a tremendous power. They were not merely names of horses, but they represented the power of the horse. And in articulating the word, that power is brought into action. So we go back now to the text of the Brihad Aranyaka, which we will continue next time and finish next time also. But just remember, the portion we had been studying was the 4 names of the horse as he carries first the gods, then the Gandharvas, then the Titans, and then mankind. Now all of this, I have also taken extra time to dwell on this origin of language, because in the first verse, you will recall, the verse ended with Vak eva asya vak. Speech verily is the sound of him. Literally translated, Vak is the speech, the sound. Vak eva asya vak. It's like saying speech alone is its speech, which doesn't make sense. So obviously it means something more. Vak here, and we have seen the deeper sense, is that creative power of the vibration moving into manifestation. That Vak is its speech. The cosmic horse, when it speaks, this tremendous divine power, remember, is the power moving from the unmanifest into manifestation. When it speaks, its speech is this vibration, which is the creative power, bringing into form, bringing into manifestation all things. Vak eva asya vak. Speech verily is the sound of him. And we can now appreciate better the sense of this portion of the first verse also. So we will continue this next Sunday. Perhaps we can just meditate on this verse that we have read. Agnim ire purohitam yajnasya. Agni I adore, who stands before the Lord.